Starting this month, top women conductors will teach the art of leading an orchestra to a group of promising female music students. It's an attempt to redress the balance in conducting, a profession taken up by very few women. Sian Edwards is head of conducting at the Royal Academy of Music, and she's also a freelance conductor. She became the first woman to conduct at the Royal Opera House in 1988, and she's going to give a masterclass on the course.
One of the problems is that when people are students, they already don't really see themselves as conductors if they're women. It's been a sort of macho role for many decades, and I think if we can encourage women, even before they've started their formal music studies, to see that it is a role that anybody can take and that it is possible for them to learn the basics and feel confident in expressing themselves in front of a group of other people, then, I think there's a possibility that we can begin to open doors in people's minds at an early enough stage for them to consider it seriously later on.
I asked Sian Edwards whether she'd experienced prejudice as a woman conductor.
It's a very subtle thing, and I think for all women, we'd all say it's very difficult to put your finger on a moment where somebody actually said, no, you can't do that, you're a girl. Nobody ever said that to me. But having said that, I think having had 30 years in the profession, I can look back, and certainly when I was younger, I can see now that the combination of being young and female was a real double whammy, actually, and made a lot of things, I think, much more difficult for me as a woman than they would have been if I had been male.
The lack of role models for women in conducting means that women's choices and behaviour at work are often called into question, says Sian Edwards.
I noticed that, my male colleagues, even young ones, assume a mantle of authority with much more ease. It's never questioned, for example, whether their tone of voice is correct, whether they're wearing the right clothes, whether they've actually dealt with a difficult situation in a way that was strong or weak or whatever. Whereas I think for women, every single step is questioned by themselves and by people outside. And that's questioned not only, I have to say, by men in this case, an orchestra situation. I think quite often women in orchestras also find it difficult having what is essentially a very different feel being led by a woman than being led by a man.
Conductor Alice Farnham, who's directing the course, says that young women can be overly daunted by the prospect of conducting.
I think one of the main things is there's an idea that to be a conductor, you need to know absolutely everything, which, the more you know, of course, the better. But actually, you've got to start somewhere. And I think particularly young women are perhaps a little more afraid than some young men to just give it a go anyway.
The conducting course is also unusual because it's based on the teaching method devised by legendary Russian conductor Ilya Musin in the 1930s. Sian Edwards became Musin's first student from the West when she went to study under him in St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, in 1983. He'd already been teaching for 50 years. The training was extremely thorough.
In the UK, I think you're lucky if you get a student group to conduct perhaps once a term, whereas in the Soviet Union, they really took the training incredibly seriously, which is why, of course, they probably produced so many very good conductors, actually. But they had a professional orchestra available, and although there were a number of, I think there were about 40 students, it was a very, very large department. Musin's class had the orchestra at least once a week, and although not everyone conducted every time, it was a marvellous opportunity. And then for the full-time students who were doing the whole 5-year course, there was also a professional opera theatre in which they would be enrolled for a year, and they'd also do a professional opera production. So the training there, I would say, was 5,000% more than any other country was offering at the time.
Musin, who taught conductors like Valery Gergiev and Yuri Chermikhanov, developed his own particular system of conducting. Sian Edwards again.
The Russian style generally is based on an understanding of legato. So the idea of singing or playing one very beautiful smooth line with no breaks or jumps in the sound, so that you control the sound from the beginning of the breath to right through to the end of the breath with the same quality and detail of the color and so on, is something that's very important to the Russian style. From that, Musin then developed a sense of this very smooth way of conducting and the idea of taking the sound and carrying it and moving it around. That combined, I think, with a very colourful Russian sense of the music being extremely present in your hands. It's not some nebulous idea that's flying around, but actually that you can take the music in your hands and mold it as if it's a piece of clay and do that with the orchestra, I think was something that was quite a revelation to me, so that instead of sort of beating on top of the music in a way, you are actually taking the music in your hands and moving it.
Musin has also influenced British conducting. Alice Farnham, who like Sian Edwards trained with him in St. Petersburg, explains.
He came over to give master classes at the Royal Academy of Music, and in fact came over to conduct the Royal Philharmonic a few times as well, age sort of 93, maybe a little younger. And suddenly everybody was talking about the St. Petersburg Musin school, and people were coming to study with this great master, and catching him, because we were all so scared that he would die. He was in his mid-90s by that stage.
Musin, who died in 1999, was always very encouraging towards his women students. So it's perhaps fitting that this new course to get more women into the profession is modelled on his approach.